The Goring Ox, an example from ancient Mesopotamia that illustrates the nature of law and justice in the age of Hammurabi, the most ancient law code that survives to this day. The principle of legal liability, the principle of negligence, a truly sophisticated legal concept that goes back to this remote ancestor of all written law. Think about it in these terms. A goring ox is an ox that is knowingly prone to gore other oxen. In our society, we might think of it as being like a pit bull. If you have a poodle and you live next to an elementary school and you don't lock up your little poodle or chihuahua, that's one thing. But if you have a pit bull and you live next to an elementary school and you let your pit bull roam free without restraint, that's another. And if something happened and the pit bull injured a kid, then you would be held liable. That would be obvious negligence, and a system of justice would say that it was proper that you are held responsible. I want us to use this example of the goring ox to notice a few things about the nature of law in the society of Hammurabi's code. First, the nature of these laws seems to arise out of what we might consider custom. And in fact, the nature of Hammurabi's law code is 282 of these kinds of principles that come out of cases. This is in fact sometimes called casuistic law. That means case-based law. It's often opposed to apodictic law, which is law by command. Thou shalt do this, or thou shalt not do that. Think about the very nature of this kind of law. If you have a goring ox and you take it down a busy street without restraining it or covering its horns somehow, and it injures someone, then you are responsible. That's a very specific kind of case. And in fact, it's much like the principle of this entire class. It's to take a specific case and to derive from that a principle. Think about what this says about the nature of law in Hammurabi's day. It actually reveals quite a lot about this society and the nature of law in this society. The laws of this society originate out of custom, specific cases that allow this society to derive more general principles of justice. In fact, the law code of Hammurabi doesn't say that people will be held liable for any case of negligence. It says that if you have a goring ox and you don't restrain it. Now that wouldn't cover every single kind of case. And we have to imagine that in this society, people would use those kind of customs, those markers, as guides to principles for justice. And in fact, the society of Hammurabi must have had at least some kind of primitive way of collecting legal knowledge, of collecting these kinds of cases. It would be an overstatement to say that there was a professional class of lawyers, of legal professionals. But at the very least, there must have been elders or men who were wise in the law, who served as judges, and who collected, who accumulated these kinds of cases that make up the law code of Hammurabi. And notice something else about this law code. This isn't legislation. We tend to think of law as legislation. That comes from the Latin for a law, a lex, legis, that is laid out, latio, that is brought forth. Legislation is the making of law. And there's no sense in the law code of Hammurabi that the king is making the law. He is enforcing the customs which exist. The king in this society had what we might call both executive and, in some sense, judicial authority. We customarily think of power dividing into executive, legislative, and judicial functions. But in this society, executive and judicial functions were by far the most important. And in fact, it's not clear that there was any kind of mechanism or institution that could create law, that could create legislation. Law arose out of custom. It arose out of a sense that there was a need for justice and that there was a natural order, a way of deriving the principles of justice and preserving those principles in cases, in a body of casuistic law. So in this society that was ruled as a monarchy by the king, who was the guarantor of a divine justice, that was a justice that was appointed by the Babylonian gods, it is a society where law begins to take shape as a body of custom that's enforced by this king.